Welcome back, guys. So this is a quick audio review of our Unit 5 topics. Again, this is meant to be listened to, like the last audio review, not necessarily watched. So we had three major topics in Unit 5. We had homeostasis, we had cell transport, and we have the nervous system. Those are the topics I'm going to be reviewing now. So, homeostasis is the process by which our bodies maintain their balance. Right? And so, if our typical body temperature is 98 degrees, our body takes efforts to maintain that temperature. Right? If I get too warm, I begin to sweat, and that cools me down. If I get too cold, I begin to shiver, and that will warm me up. That's a very macro example of homeostasis. This kind of thing occurs on a cellular level as well. And so if I have too much salt in my blood, I have mechanisms to dump the salt out. If I have too acidic of blood, I have mechanisms to bring that acidity back to a neutral level. So homeostasis is just the mechanisms by which our body maintains its state. Right? And that helps all of our cellular processes work properly because they work best under the conditions that we're at. These are maintained through feedback loops, and feedback loops are just a response mechanism. So you have a stimuli, something that causes the event, and you have the response, which is the reaction to the event. So in my original example, getting too hot would be the stimuli, and the response would be sweating. Right? And so we have two types of feedback loops. We have positive feedback loops and we have negative feedback loops. In positive feedback loops, the stimuli is perpetuated by the response. And so when you have a positive feedback loop, if the example was positive, if I got too hot, maybe I would shiver and I would get hotter. Okay? And then I'd shiver more and I'd get hotter again. That would be a positive feedback loop. The response builds up the initial stimuli. Most of our homeostatic responses are negative feedback loops because usually we're trying to counteract whatever change it is that's occurring to our body. And so negative feedback loops are when the stimuli counters, or rather the response counters the stimuli. And so in the real example, when I get too hot, I sweat and I cool back down with a negative feedback loop. On a cellular level, most of the homeostasis occurs through the process of cell transport. And cell transport is just the moving of molecules in and out of the cell. So we have to cross the cell membrane to get in and out of the cell, and the mechanism by which we do so is cell transport. There are two types of cell transport. There is active transport and there is passive transport. Active transport requires the use of ATP as an energy source. Passive transport is driven by the process of diffusion. And so in passive transport, the molecules will always move from an area of high concentration towards an area of low concentration. They go from where there's more of the stuff to where there's less of the stuff. And that happens naturally through random dispersion of molecules. Active transport typically moves from the low to the high, and our cells use active transport to maintain homeostasis when the balance is not on that natural gradient. Right? So if my cell wants a lot of potassium inside of it, it can use active transport to suck potassium in, even if there's already a lot of potassium inside. The properties of cell transport are driven mostly by the properties of the cellular membrane. And so the cell membrane is composed primarily of phospholipids. And phospholipids have two regions. There's a phosphate group at the top of it, and there's a lipid group at the bottom of it. The phosphate group is polar and likes polar molecules, such as water. The lipid group is nonpolar and dislikes polar molecules, such as water. The lipid layer is sandwiched in between two phosphate layers, and so the interior of the membrane is hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. It also doesn't like any polar substances. So polar substances and ionic substances cannot cross the membrane due to the fact that this lipid region does not like them. Large molecules cannot cross the membrane because they're just too large to fit between the gaps. In order to move those kinds of molecules, polar, ionic, and large molecules, we need to utilize protein channels that are embedded within the membrane, and they serve as little gateways. Active transport uses these gateways as well, but in conjunction with ATP to purposefully move molecules in one direction. And the nervous system is the body system that we use to assess our conditions and respond accordingly. Our nervous system includes our brain, our spinal cord, and all of the nerves throughout our body. The brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord make up what is called the central nervous system. All the other nerves in our body make up the peripheral nervous system. And they're a communication system, and they pass signals of stimuli and response back and forth. And so if I were to prick my finger, there are nerves in my finger that receive that stimuli and get excited by that stimuli. That excitement is passed up a nerve through my arm to my spinal cord. Another neuron receives that signal and it passes it along to the brain. The brain is able to assess where the original stimuli came from, what kind of nerve it came from, and by assessing what kind of nerve it came from, it knows what kind of stimuli it was. Right? And so we have nerves that will sense specifically pain, nerves that sense specifically heat or pressure. Right? So depending on what nerve is sending the signal to the brain knows what kind of signal it was. The brain then responds with a signal back down to the appropriate area, right? And it will send a message to the muscles that say something like move if it's something painful. That connection between the brain and the muscle is called innervation. And by sending that signal, it triggers the muscle to move. The cells that make up the nervous system are called neurons. They have a very unique shape. They have a typical cell body that is much like all other cells that we have. But on the front side of that cell body, there are long branching structures called dendrites that have receptors on them. On the back side of that cell body, there's a long tail-like structure called an axon that passes the messaging along to the next neuron. And between the end of the axon and the next neuron, there's a space called the synapse. And so these neurons are used to communicate throughout our nervous system. And that's it for our Unit 5 audio review. Cool? Thanks. Bye.